Solomon chapter 4 is where we're going to be at today. Last week we finished up with their courtship and kind of saw them at the wedding. We saw that, Shulamith said, "Banner over me is love." It was actual representation of Solomon rolling out the banner and putting it over kind of top of her as she was standing there in the court to let people know this was pretty much, this was his lady. And then we kind of saw the leading up to the marriage. And then the wedding, of course, we would have known, obviously, during this time, this wedding would have been probably quite the ordeal. It would have probably been quite a couple of days an event, huge feast, and all the kind of things that would have been going on with weddings, especially as big of a wedding as this would have been with the royalty that was taking place. And so then we get to that. That's how we finished up chapter 3. And then we get to chapter 4, and what we see is the ending of the wedding, and we're going to take a chapter here and kind of see the intimacy of the wedding and in the wedding night. And then we're going to kind of move from that into chapter 5 and then through the rest of the book to them kind of growing old together and still get some of the problems, some of the complications that arise in their marriage. And how they kind of deal with these things. There's kind of a season of where things aren't going real good, and they kind of have to kind of work through that. And that's how we finish up the lesson today. Is we kind of see this euphoria of love, and then essentially the honeymoon's over, and then they kind of get to reality and start to have a few problems, and how they work through this, and how even through the problems in the marriage they continue to grow in love. And we'll finish up next week. As they're kind of getting older in life and looking more through kind of how they mature through their life together. So we have 2 lessons left in the book of Song of Solomon, and that will pretty much finish us up here for the books of Solomon that we've been studying with Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and the Song of Solomon. And then we'll be moving on to something else. I don't know what that is yet, but we'll be heading somewhere. So we start off here. First portion of this, of chapter 4, is very kind of lovely, very delicate wedding night scene that we see. And Solomon uses some very, very poetic, tender language when he's talking to Shulamith, talking about her beauty, talking about her purity. And then towards the end of chapter 4, God kind of interjects and adds his words of affirmation to the approval of this intimacy that they are experiencing, because they have been doing things the way in which God had intended. And then the second part, again, chapter 5, we see a strain on their relationship. And what we can see about this is how love maintains, how to maintain a loving relationship, and then kind of how to work through some of these things. So let's start off here with chapter 4. Let's read the first 11 verses, and we kind of see some of the things that Solomon is saying here about Shulamith. "Behold, thou art fair, my love. Behold, thou art fair. Thou hast dove's eyes within thy locks. Thy hair is a flock of goats that appear from Mount Gilead." Now, we're going to come back to that one in a second. He's not saying her hair is mangy like a goat. We're going to come back to that one in a second. "Thy teeth are like flocks of sheep that are even shorn, which came up from the washing, whereof every one bare twins, and none is barren among them. Thy lips are like a thread of scarlet. Thy speech is comely. Thy temples are like a piece of pomegranates within thy locks. Thy neck is like the Tower of David, built for an armory, whereon thou hang 1,000 bucklers, all shielded of mighty men. Thy 2 breasts are like thy 2 young roes that are twins, which feed among the lilies. Until the day break, and the shadows flee away, I will get me to the mountain of myrrh, and to the hills of frankincense. Thou art all fair, my love, there is no spot in thee. Come with me from Lebanon, my spouse, with me from Lebanon to look from the top of Amana, from the top of Shenir and Hermon, from the lion's dens, from the mountains of leopards. Thou hast ravished my heart, my sister, my spouse. Thou hast ravished my heart with one of thine eyes, with one chain of thy neck. How fair is thy love, my sister, my spouse. How much better is thy love than wine, and the smell of thine ointments than all spices. Thy lips, O my spouse, drops as the honeycombs. Honey and milk are under thy tongue, and the smell of thy garment is like the smell of loved. So we see here in these 11 verses that Solomon is just showering here Shulamith with compliments, and it's being very delicate, very poetic in his appreciation for Shulamith. And some of these descriptions that Solomon uses we can kind of see how they're very kind of poetic in what he's saying. And some of them, again, like I mentioned with the one with the goats, and then the one another one we're going to look at here, the tower of the armory, kind of doesn't really make as much sense to us when you consider kind of the where they're at, and kind of in their in their room there on their wedding night, and they're obviously very much in love, and they're showering each other with compliments, and we kind of get to this point where he looks at her and says, you're kind of like a bunch of goats coming from a field. And we can't see, I guess, the beauty in that language. But what Solomon is doing is that he is speaking to Shulamith in ways in which she understands. He's using analogies and using language that she would very much be very, very comfortable with. Because we remember her background. She kind of was a farm girl from the country. And he's using comparisons to make her feel more comfortable. And to really express his love to her, and then essentially speaking her dialect and coming into it to the time that they're having together. Now, again, those 11 verses, some of the descriptions are very clear that he's speaking very lovingly to her. That we get to the first one he kind of used there with the goats that appear from the Mount of Gilead, and he's essentially describing her hair as these flocks of goats from this. Now, even now in Israel and during this time as well, even today, we've probably seen these videos of the goats over there that can pretty much just scale up and down mountainsides. And it doesn't look like there's any footing for them there at all. But you see the videos of them just kind of hopping up, just pretty much sheer cliff faces. And they stand there, and that's how they get away from the predators, and that's where they live in little areas up there. And it's very interesting and actually kind of wild to see those goats. And do y'all know what I'm kind of talking about? We've seen the videos of those goats that go up and down the cliff faces. And she would have seen this where she was at. She would have seen these goats being able to do this. So what he's doing is that he is comparing the fact that they're so graceful in how they move up and down these cliff faces. That is the comparison that he's making to her. Now, he's not calling her a mangy-old goat. He's actually describing that she's just graceful. Her hair, the curls in her hair is as delicate as these goats that are able to kind of move around seamlessly and effortlessly on where nothing else can really go. So he's using, again, some language that she's able to understand, talking about how the curls are cascading around her neck and how beautiful her hair is. So he's complimenting her and using some language that she kind of understands. Another one that's a little bit difficult for us, I guess, if we kind of look at it, is in verse 4. If I look at Haley and tell her neck looked like a tower that David built full of armor, it doesn't seem like much of a compliment. But what he is saying to her is that he's using more imagery, saying that when he looked upon her neck, or looked at how lovely that she was, he was experiencing for him the same kind of delight that when he saw all the shields of all his mighty men standing around and giving him comfort and giving him protection. So when he sees those things, her neck and then that tower as well, it gives him joy, gives him confidence, and gives him comfort in that. So 11 verses here on the wedding night, and we can see that Solomon, even up to this point, has been pretty descriptive with how he's described Shulamith, but he's really kind of ramped up the poetry and the romance during this scene that we see. So the question that the lesson wants us to ask is this, and it says this: how important, men, are poetic, romantic words to you or to us? And how important are they to your wife? Whose level of importance of the romantic language do you let drive whether or not you speak romantically to your wife? even if it means simply just buying her a card with some kind of mushy poem on it. Solomon was showing his sensitivity to his wife by using very romantic language with her. He wasn't primarily doing it for himself. He was crafting words to please his wife. And in his excitement about being able to make love to Shulamith, Solomon did not overlook her fearful thoughts and some of the doubts that she would have. And in verse 8, we see he's using some names of places to refer to what's very inaccessible and very dangerous. And Solomon is urging her to come away with him to this specific type of intimacy that we see in verse 8 again. Come with me from Lebanon, my spouse. Come with me from Lebanon. Look up the top of Amana, from the top of Shanir and Hermon, from the lion's den, from the mountains of the leopard. So he's talking about very dangerous places because he's understanding the uneasiness, I'm sure, that Shulamith is feeling, and telling her that, even though he understands that she's concerned and understands that she is a little bit fearful, that she needs to come with him to these places, to this intimacy that they can have. And even with the excitement and the worry about it, Solomon is urging her to kind of not be so as concerned with it. Now he continues to describe the just empowering effect that Shulamith is having on him in verses again 9, 10, and 11, ravishing his heart. Talking about how it's just one of her eyes just completely encapsulates him. And so he's talking about her love being very intoxicating and how her kisses were just so delightful for him. And this physical intimacy that they were getting ready to be able to share with one another was going to be everything and more that they had hoped it would be as they had been waiting for this moment. So we see again Solomon being very romantic in his language to his wife to make her feel obviously very good about herself, make her feel at ease as well, but to give her just more compliments and more romantic language to express his love even more to her. Now, and we always, men and women, understand that there is a very different divide a lot of times on how men express themselves romantically and how women wish men would express themselves and how women express themselves romantically. And I mean, that's in relationships and in marriages, a lot of times that causes a very specific divide. Because the emotional attachment that men and women are supposed to express and supposed to feel with each other sometimes gets lost in the shuffle because of the way in which the two different genders express themselves. And so we see this scene here in the book of Song of Solomon. He's making sure that it's in there specifically for both sides of the spectrum to understand that there is a place for romance. There is a place for this man and woman being able to shower each other with compliments and making sure that each other is taken care of emotionally by the way in which we say things. Now, Haley will be probably one of the first people to tell you that I'm not a hopeless romantic. I never have been. And I don't think that I ever will be. But I do, and she may shake her head, but I do try to do little things that lets her know that I appreciate the fact that what she does for our marriage. Now, I may not go buy her a bunch of roses and flowers and candy and come home with letters of things, but I try to find ways that even sometimes can be difficult for me to express how much I love to her, but more than just saying, hey, I love you, or babe, thanks for doing this. And I think that this part of Song of Solomon is in there to kind of push the man in the relationship to be more romantic and to be more expressive in letting our spouses know how much we love them. Okay, and I know that even as seeing Mom and Dad in their marriage and seeing Grandma and Grandpa Rother and Grandma and Grandpa Compton in their marriage, and Chad and Sid in their marriage, and kind of the examples that I get to see a lot, I'm not going to try to throw Dad under the bus. Didn't see Dad doing a ton of romantic stuff as far as buying Mom flowers and roses and stuff, but I saw him appreciating her in other ways. And I think that's very important for especially single people who will be into relationships later on, that while sometimes we have to kind of step out of our comfort zone a little bit, and even for me, stepping out of my comfort zone a little bit to make sure that Haley feels appreciated, feels loved, and that she feels equal partner in the relationship they're going on. Now, we're getting ready to experience a whole other level of that, right, when the baby comes. And it's going to be a whole nother experience that we're going to have, that I saw Chad and I've seen Chad and Sid go through, and seeing other people, but it's seeing it and experiencing it is something entirely different. And that's all things that you all know, and you're laughing and shaking your head because you realize how much our relationship is about to change even more when the baby comes. And it will be important even then to make sure that I, as a husband, she's going to go through her problems with a new baby. I need to make sure that I am staying supportive, staying romantic in whatever way that I can to let her know that she is still feeling loved. And we see that changing now. So we get to where we've seen all these wonderful things of the relationship, and even some more here towards the end of chapter 4. But we get to chapter 5 and we kind of see that honeymoon period being over, and that the romance is gone a little bit. And Shulamith and Solomon kind of have this little bit of a division, and that they kind of have to rekindle the love again, which is, I think that, hey, and I haven't really been married that long, but for some of you all who have been married much longer, have probably experienced times of a day or two or a week or whatever it was where you all were just at each other's throats for whatever reason it may be, and there was a bit of a distance there. But the relationship works because even through that, you find a way to kind of come back together as far as making sure that you get back on the same communicative path. So with verses 12, 13, 14, and 15, we see some more of Solomon just kind of giving her some more compliments. And as what we see in these verses is the consummation essentially of the marriage. And we'll move through this here so we kind of get to chapter 5 and kind of see how this changes. But so verses 12 here, a garden enclosed is my sister, my spouse, a spring shut up, a fountain is sealed. Here Solomon is praising Shulamith for her virginity. He's praising her for her purity. He's praising her for the fact that she waited. They had waited to have this type of physical intimacy until after they were married. Because this is a priceless gift they have for each other. And he's using poetic images here to describe. Verse 12 again, a garden enclosed is my sister, my spouse, a spring shut up, a fountain that's sealed. We know fountains are beautiful things. Gardens are beautiful things. And a sealed one that's never been used before or seen before. Solomon is praising her for her purity and the desire that he had because of that. Verse 14 as well, spikenard and saffron, calamus and cinnamon, with all trees of frankincense, myrrhs and aloes, with all chief spices, a fountain of gardens, a well of living water, and streams from Lebanon. And again, he's using these poetic languages here to kind of express what the feelings that he has for her as we see the consummation of their marriage. Verse 16 as well, awake, O north wind, and come thou south, blow upon my garments, let the spices may flow out. Let my beloved come into his garden and eat his pleasant fruits. This is Shulamith speaking here and talking about the physical intimacy that they're having. And then I am coming to my garden, my sister, my spouse. I have gathered my myrrh with my spices. I have eaten my honeycomb with my honey. I have drunk my wine with my milk. And again, talking about the intimacy that they're having. They're just expressing it in a very poetic way. And again, we could get into this in detail. I won't. We all know what's happening here. But the reason these verses are here, okay, and the reason this is kind of talked about in the way that it is written here in Song of Solomon, is that it's God's way of letting us know that physical intimacy, sexual relationships is what God had intended for married people. All right? And there is no guilt and shame in sex as long as it was done in the way in which God has intended. All right? Now, if you move out of that, All right, if the intimacy comes before marriage, then there's going to be guilt and shame that follows that, because that is not the way God had it planned. The relationship between man and woman, carried from the wedding night through all of life. There's few things, probably not many things, there isn't anything more fulfilling between those two people than having that type of relationship, and then be able to see it flower and grow and continue on and mature through life. And that's exactly the way in which God intended it. You move away from that, then there's not going to be frankincense and myrrh and gardens of luscious fruits and all the things we see here as they are described in this book. But God intended it that way. He gave it to us as a blessing. And that's, as long as it has stayed within the institution in which God has given it to us, then it will be as Solomon has described it here. Okay? So then we see verse 1 of chapter 5, the last part of this. We kind of see what the last line of the song here of this wedding. More than likely, God himself is speaking this last part of this verse. And what he's doing is he's giving them approval on the union that they have together. It says, "O friends, drink abundantly, O beloved." And God is using or expressing approval on this union, on their sexual union, on their physical union, on their spiritual and emotional union as well, as these two become man and wife. And again, one more time, it's just confirming that sex is not bad, but sex with the right person, your spouse, at the right time within marriage is blessed by God. Okay? Then we get to verse 2 of chapter 5. So we've seen this euphoric moment. Their love has been consummated. We've seen them kind of growing together in love as we move through this. And then we get to what I like to call reality. Right? The honeymoon phase is over, and we see some dangers here and some problems happen. And we see this happen because of insensitivity. All right, insensitivity. And the danger of insensitivity through chapter 6, verse 13. We get to verse 2, and it says this: "I sleep, but my heart waketh. It is the voice of my beloved that knocketh, saying, Open to me, my sister, my love, my dove, my undefiled. For my head is filled with dew, and my locks with drops of the night." What we see once again happening is that there's been a time that has passed. Shulamith enters into another expression of this dream-like state, or this nightmare that she's having, okay, that she begins to have. And it's to describe this painful experience that she's having in her relationship with Solomon. Now, this changes very quickly. It's kind of like a kaleidoscope, but it all kind of fits together. And we see the feelings that she is experiencing because of this. All right, verse 3, it says this: "I have put off my coat. How shall I put it on? I have washed my feet. How shall I defile them? My beloved put his hand in my hole of the door, and my bowels were moved from him. I rose up to upon my beloved, and my hands dropped with myrrh, my fingers with sweet-smelling myrrh upon the handles of thy lock. I opened to my beloved, but my beloved had withdrawn himself and was gone. My soul failed when he spake. I sought him, I could not find him. I called him, but he gave no answer. The watchmen that went out of the city found me. They smote me, they wounded me. The keepers of the walls took away my veil from me. I charge ye, O daughters of Jerusalem, to find my beloved, that ye tell him that I am sick of love." So we see now what happens here is Shulamith is taking her attention off of Solomon and spending more time in her focus on enjoying just herself. All right, and being very self-centered. She's worried more about herself than she's worried about Solomon. All right, and we see as we move through these verses, we begin to see the feelings that she and Solomon are experiencing of agitation, of panic, and this overwhelming feeling that they're having because they're having some problems within their marriage. She pictures Solomon in verses 2 and 3 here, coming to her at night and addressing her extravagantly, and Shulamith responds to him with insensitivity. Doesn't really care that he's there. kind of tired of seeing him because he's coming home late because he's been at work or whatever. She's been working all day at the house doing stuff, or she's been at work herself, and he's coming home and he's tired and she's tired, and they're not going to talk to each other, and they're trying to keep, kind of talk to each other, but they want to see each other, they want to speak to each other, so we can kind of see the strain here that's on this relationship. And in the process of this, we see her at some point in her dream here that we see, especially in verse 7, she goes out to the people because she can't find Solomon because he's not coming home. And she asks the watchman where he's at, and instead of them telling her, they find her and grab her and beat her and beat her up. And they think that they beat her because they think that she's a prostitute. So we see here this awful nightmare that Shulamith is having. And she's despairing here because she's trying to find Solomon, because she's been the one that's kind of pushed him away with her insensitivity. She appeals to verse 8. We saw to the daughters of Jerusalem. And she asked them to tell Solomon if they see her that she really does love him. She really is consumed with love for him. That even though she's not been expressing it for X amount of days or months or whatever, that she really does love him. And she uses in verse 8 of chapter 5, I charge you, my daughters, that you tell him that I am sick of love. The same phrase she used back in chapter 2 when they first started to date, first started to court each other, to let him know how he felt about her, or let her know how she felt about him. She uses the same phrases. Now, she had gotten into a rut in the marriage. They both have. They've gotten into a rut of insensitivity, to where they're not as concerned for the other person. Okay, now, you guys that have been married for several years, I'm sure you've all, again, experienced these ruts, these times of insensitivity towards your spouse, because they've just been irritating you, they're getting on your nerves, or whatever it may be. All right, I've had somebody tell me before Haley and I got married that once we get kind of into our marriage a little bit and kind of get into a groove of things, that at some points you may look at your wife while she's brushing her teeth and you just want to just pop her in the back of the head because just the way she brushes her teeth is wearing you out. All right, and I'm sure that's something that you've all experienced, that just the way she's brushing them is just making me mad. I got to get out of here for a second. And that's the type of insensitivity that they kind of are going through here. It's a rough patch in their marriage. A rough patch in our marriage. Now, Haley and I we haven't really been in any knockdown, drag-out fights, but we've had, even in the short time we've been together, had a couple of rough patches that we've had to kind of work through. And I know that those things are just going to kind of keep coming more and more as life goes on. And so we see that here, and I think that's in here for us so that we can see how we've had this picture-perfect relationship with these two people. Everything's been great. It's been a Hallmark movie the whole way through, and now we see a rough patch, and how do they handle it? And that's the same thing here that we see. All right, so we see this going on. Verse 8, telling him, the only way that Shulamith thinks that she can rekindle the love here is to think back on the very foundations of their relationship. That's why she uses phrases that they were using at the very beginning. Because she knows that the only way to rekindle the fire, only way to make sure the relationship is back whole again, is to go back to the foundations of the marriage. And here's the lesson for us as married people, and people who will be married if you're single or whatever it may be. If the relationship is based on God, if the love between two people, if the foundation is God, that even during the rough patches, even during the difficult times, if you go back to the foundation, which is God, the love will be rekindled. That's the lesson that we see here. Because these two were doing things in the way in which God had intended. Shulamith finds, I got to go back to the foundation of this. The foundation of our love for each other was built on God. That helps them rekindle the fire. Don't lose focus. Don't lose focus on who is at the head of the relationship. Don't lose focus on who's in charge of the relationship. Because it isn't me, it isn't Haley. The person in charge is God. And if we can keep that on the focus, then my feelings, the fact that she's might have hurt my feelings a little bit, or she said something that's irritating me a little bit, it's kind of just grinding at me, where I've said the same thing to her, then that gets my situation and what I think should be done right, that gets me out of the way if I can remember that this relationship has nothing to do with Lance and nothing to do with Haley. It has the relationship has everything to do with how Lance and Haley are serving God together. So when the rough patches come, when the difficult times come, if we can remember that we're in this thing together and we're serving God because God puts us together, we go back to the foundation of our relationship, and then we can work our way through the difficult times. Look at verse 9 of chapter 5. Why is thou beloved more than another beloved? O thou fairest among women, why is thou beloved more than another beloved, and thou dost so charge us? So let's go all the way down to chapter 6 and verse 3. Let's read all these. My beloved is white and ruddy, the chief among 10,000. His head is as the most fine gold. His locks are bushy, as black as a raven. His eyes are the eyes of doves, by the rivers of waters, washed with milk and fitly set. His cheeks are as bed of spices, as sweet flowers. His lips like lilies, dropping sweet-smelling myrrh. His hands are as gold rings, set with beryl. His belly is as bright ivory overlaid with sapphires. His legs are as pillars of marble, set upon sockets of fine gold. His countenance is as Lebanon, excellent as the cedars. His mouth is most sweet, yea, is altogether lovely. This is my beloved, and this is my friend, O daughters of Jerusalem. Whither is thou, beloved, gone? O thou fairest among women. Whither is thou, beloved, turned aside, that thou mayst seek with thee? My beloved is gone down into his garden, to the beds of spices, and feed in the gardens, and gather the lilies. I am my beloved, and my beloved is mine. He feedeth among the lilies. So they saw Shulamith here and Solomon sit down and talk. And they're rehashing the problems, the insensitivities, and the insecurities that they have. They begin again to flower each other with more compliments. But if we're seeing this, if we're watching this go on, right? If Kirk Cameron is making this movie, right? If this is Fireproof 2 or whatever it is, if we're making this movie and we see this happening, this is the moment that they're sitting down at dinner or they're in bed and they've got their Bibles open and they're spending time on their relationship, praying. They're looking into the Bible. They're reading scriptures. They're probably crying. They're talking. They're apologizing to each other, and they are getting back to the very basis of what their relationship should be, and that's two people serving God together. Two people serving God together. Because with the difficult things that happen, the focus has to remain. All right? The focus has to remain that God is at the head. So we get to verse 4 of chapter 6, and because we've had this moment now where they've sat down and they've talked through their problems and they've confessed their sins through each other, the things they've been doing behind each other's backs or whatever it may be, and they're moving together. This fire has been rekindled. The love is back, and we get to verses 4 through 13, and we see the restoration here of their marriage. And it says, Thou art beautiful, O my love, as Tisra, comely as Jerusalem, terrible as an army with banners. Turn away thine eyes from me, for they have overcome me. Thy hair is as flocks of goats that appear from Gilead. Thy teeth are as flocks of sheep, which go up from the washing whereof everyone beareth twins. There is not one barren among them. As a piece of pomegranate are thy temples within thy locks. There are 80 queens and 80 concubines, and virgin without number. My dove, my undefiled, is but one. She is the only one of her mother. She is the choice of the one that bare her. The daughters saw her, the blessed, and blessed her. Yea, the queens and concubines, and they praised her. Who is the king? Who is she that looketh forth as the morning? For as the moon's clear as the sun, and terrible as an army with banners. I went down to the gardens of nuts to see the fruits of the valley, and to see whether the vine flourished and the pomegranates budded. Or ever I was aware, my soul made me like chariots of Amminadab. Return, return, O Shulamite, return, return, that we may look upon thee. What will ye see in Shulamite? And if that, as it were the company of two army. So we see their restoration of their marriage here. And what she found is exceeded the fondest of her hopes. Solomon's love embraced her with forgiveness. The relationship is restored. She again could ride proudly with him in his chariot. She once again would feel like she was on top of the world. As we see in verses all the way down through verse 12 of chapter 6, the restoration of their marriage. And then we get to verse 13, which is kind of a verse that's just kind of thrown in there. It doesn't really go with the rest of that little monologue there, talking about the restoration of their love. And the description of verse 13, which sets us up for chapter 7, is that Solomon here... or we see Solomon and Shulamith, we kind of see are observing them in their love and in their joy together. There are people that were there and seeing them together and seeing them back together after knowing that there was a time that they had some problems and going on, but they were back together or back with each other as far as working back together within the relationship. And God had restored their marriage, and the love had been restored as well. So we see that the difficult time, them working through that, and then we get to chapter 7, which we'll finish up with next week. It will be chapter 7 and 8. And we can see these two people rejoicing in their togetherness. We see long-term love, them maturing in love together, and then continuing to make sure that even with the maturation of their love, that God still stays in the center of it. And because He is in the center of it, they are allowed to grow and rejoice in their togetherness. All right, so that's what the wedding up to, I guess, the first big fight, we can call it. And then we see finished up next week with them growing together through chapter 7 and chapter 8. All right, so let's pray. We'll finish up for the day. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for our lesson here in the book of Song of Solomon. And even though, Lord, sometimes the language can be a little bit, I guess, hard to kind of interpret and understand the word, but we can see a beautiful picture of two people loving each other, growing in love together, marrying one another, working through their problems, and continuing to build a life together that is honoring and pleasing unto you, Lord. And the reason they're able to do all these things is because they're making sure that at the very center of this relationship, they're both understanding that they are here, Lord, in the relationship to honor, serve, and please you. Well, it's the exact same thing for each one of us, that for the ones that are married, for the ones that are going to be married, Lord, or even just the ones who are going to stay single, we still can see a beautiful lesson of making sure that if we can continue to put our desires, our wants, our insecurities, the things that we think that we need, if we can put those things away from us, we can focus in completely on what you want for us, that there's true freedom, Lord, in living a life that is fully serving you. So I pray that when we understand that, we come to the realization of the importance of that, and that we are constantly working towards that in our own lives, so that we, again, Lord, can be more effective in our service of you. And I pray for Pastor as he comes in the next hour, that you use him in a mighty way as well, Lord, to keep us attentive, not just with our ears, Lord, but with our hearts as well, so we can, again, listen to the lessons and truths that you'd have for us as well. In your name I pray. Amen.